The parts of East Africa inhabited by Somali peoples had been colonized by the European powers relatively late in the 19th century. By the 1890s, the region was loosely divided between the British, the French, and the Italians. This foreign presence led to a resistance movement and a religious revival led by Sayyid Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, which fought a bitter campaign against the British, the Italians, and their Somali allies for 20 years. In this episode, we'll take a look at events in Somalia up until the death of Hassan and the end of his movement exactly 100 years ago in January 1921. In 1895, Somalia was a region mostly under the influence of the British and Italians, who'd established colonial rule but mostly stayed in a few port cities and exercised their power indirectly through local proxies. They had little presence or influence in the interior of the region. The Italians had treaties with the local sultanates of Orbia and Majertene, but their rulers regularly went their own way. Somali society was even further fragmented because it was based around independent pastoral tribes who often fought each other and raided into Ethiopian territory as well. This fragile situation was soon to be shaken even further by the return of Somalia to a man by the name of Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, who was called the Mad Mullah by the British or the Sayyid by many Somalis, also known as the Master. Hassan had studied Islam in the British protectorate of Aden under the influential cleric Muhammad Saleh, who preached a very strict brand of Islam associated with the Wahhabist revival in Arabia. Hassan was also unhappy with the presence of Europeans in his homeland, and legend has it that as he disembarked in Somalia, he argued with a British customs official and was angered at seeing Somali children in the care of French missionaries. Now, historians debate as to whether his religion or his anti-colonialist nationalism was more important, or whether they can even be separated. But what's clear is that both of these motivations underpinned a movement that would change the history of the Horn of Africa. Hassan opened a school in 1895 in Berbera, but soon moved to the interior, where he began to attract followers because of his charismatic preaching against materialism, heresy, and non-Muslim foreigners. By 1899, he had about 3,000 followers, who became known as dervishes. Soon after, he declared jihad against those Somalis he viewed as heretics, and also against the European powers. In the years that followed, his forces waged a determined guerrilla campaign against other Somali tribes, the Italians, the Ethiopians, and the British. The British responded by sending expeditionary forces against the dervishes, but even though they did manage to defeat Hassan's forces on some occasions, he simply retreated to the Nugal region in the interior, and they could not stamp out the movement. There were some major engagements in this conflict, with British newspapers reporting up to 1,200 dervish dead in a single battle in 1904. The Italians, on the other hand, were much more cautious. A naval officer expressed his doubts about the British approach. "I wish that I were mistaken, but I fear that the expedition will end in a fiasco. The Mad Mullah will become a myth for the British, who will never come across him, and a serious worry for the Italian administration and our sphere of influence." He would eventually be proven right, but for the moment, diplomacy was able to put a stop to the fighting. In 1905, the Italians signed a treaty with the Mullah, to which the British also agreed. The treaty created a territory of Nugal under Hassan's control. This new protectorate was also a convenient buffer state between the sultanates of Orbia and Majertene, which were both Italian clients, but were also in conflict with each other. So by 1905, the Islamic anti-colonial dervish movement under Mullah Hassan had taken root in the Nugal region. And Hassan now set about trying to build a new state, the likes of which Somalia had never seen before. Hassan's dervish state had a structure and an ideology that were unique in Somali practice up until that time. The mullah was the unquestioned head of the state, but he did have a council of trusted ministers as well. Next in the hierarchy came his bodyguards, followed by the units of the regular army. The mass of his followers, sometimes consisting of whole tribes, changed as his fortunes waxed and waned. Somali historian Abdi Sheikh Abdi has characterized the dervish state like this. The mullah's organization had all the trappings of a theocratic or even martial state. Hassan's brand of Islamic teachings was one part of the ideological glue that held the dervish state together, but it was something new in Somali society. Traditionally, most Somalis had practiced a much less stricter form of Islam and had a relatively egalitarian culture, for men at least, which allowed most to speak their minds openly, and they had no particular unifying ideology. In the mullah's state, however, his word was law, and all the followers had to swear loyalty to both him and his teacher Saleh. Justice was harsh, including extensive use of the death penalty. British colonial administrator Douglas Jardine recorded his view of the mullah's state. The mullah was, of course, well aware that there is not in British Somaliland a native ruler who has any control over his tribe so effective that it would impel the tribesmen to do anything they disliked from loyalty to their duly constituted leader. This is why he cut offending throats and slew innocent women and children. Hassan didn't just try to coerce his followers though, he also tried to persuade them. He appealed to anti-foreign sentiment and religion across tribal lines, which was quite a rare thing in Somali history. Although it is true that the Darod, Dulbuhanta and Bakeri tribes were overrepresented in the dervish movement. Hassan made this pan-tribalism explicit. I also inform you that I am a pilgrim and a holy fighter, and have no wish to gain power and greatness in this world. Neither am I of the tribes Dulbuhanta, the Warsangli, the Mijatain, nor the Ogadi. And I am not of the hypocrites. I am a dervish, hoping for God's mercy and consent and forgiveness and guidance. And I desire that all the country and the Muslims may be victorious by God's grace. Another reason for Hassan's popularity was that for a time he was able to provide some structure and some degree of security in the face of the anarchy that was plaguing much of the region. About 1/3 of the Somali population in the interior died during the chaos, and some judged they'd be better off inside the mullah's camp than in the maelstrom of tribal and colonial fighting around it. During the less unstable years of his reign, the dervish state was able to capture large flocks of livestock from other Somali tribes and also make some improvements to local infrastructure. After Hassan's eventual defeat, British Major H. Rain recalled the impressions of one of his men upon entering a dervish settlement. He was impressed by the strength of the place, the excellent buildings, and the general sanitary arrangements. A dam had been built across the stream, and an excellent garden had been laid. There was no doubt that the mullah was a thoroughly capable man. So in just a few years, the dervish state became a force to be reckoned with, even though it was in a constant state of flux due to violence and instability. But the peace of 1905 would not last for long. Starting in 1908, the situation began to deteriorate. There was extensive intertribal raiding, and there were tensions even within the mullah's own camp. He fell out with his former friend and advisor, who then traveled to Aden and denounced him to his former teacher Saleh, who then wrote a letter to Hassan condemning him. I have before my eyes the news that you and your people have got into bad ways and no longer respect the Sharia. Of this I have proof, for you and your people raid and rob and enjoy the women and wives of those men whom you kill and whose goods you take for your own. I do not approve of this, for it is against the law and the word of our holy Prophet Muhammad. This conflict actually caused some of the dervishes to revolt, but Hassan prevailed. And even at this stage, he still had about 5,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry under his command. His forces broke the agreement with the Italians and attacked the Sultanate of Mijratayn. But this time, they were driven out of the Nugal and into British Somaliland to the north, where he then clashed with British forces and their Somali allies, which forced them to retreat to the coastal towns. In 1913, Hassan made his base at Taleh, where there was a major fort. So the dervish movement was now more of a British problem than an Italian one, even though it was still central to the politics of the entire region, as Italian Foreign Minister Francesco Guicciardini pointed out in 1910. Until the phenomenon of the mullah is eliminated or modified, it does not seem right to me to hope that the region will overcome the present phase of insecurity and of anarchy and enter into the phase of political and economic settlement. To remove this tumor from the breast of Somalia, we must employ a consistent, bland remedy, weakening the mullah by making the coastal and land blockade about him ever tighter, and by increasing the powers of resistance of the sultanates and of the peoples that surround him. So by 1913, Hassan's dervish movement was now based in British Somaliland after further fighting. In 1914, the outbreak of the Great War would once again reshuffle the cards in the Horn of Africa. Now, Somalia was not directly involved in the Great War, but it was nonetheless affected. The Germans and Ottomans encouraged Muslims in Allied colonies to rise up. And in 1917, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed V even made Hassan Emir of Somalia, on paper at least, and even the paper letter informing him of his promotion was intercepted by the Italians. Hassan did request Ottoman troops, but none were sent, although the Central Powers did try to bring Ethiopia under their influence, and Hassan was positively disposed to an alliance with the new Muslim Emperor of Ethiopia, Liji Iyasu, in 1916. But since Iyasu was deposed a few months later, any plans for cooperation with Ethiopia simply fell through. One German did end up in Somalia by accident during the war, but he was a mechanic who was taken to the mullah's court and forced to repair old rifles on pain of flogging. So with no support from the Central Powers and no Ethiopian alliance, the mullah was not able to take advantage of the British and Italian commitments in Europe during the World War. Although his situation was becoming more and more unfavorable, Hassan remained defiant. In March 1917, he vigorously denied British accusations that he'd been negotiating with the Central Powers. "It is you who have joined with all the peoples of the world, with harlots, with wastrels, and with slaves, just because you are so weak. But if you were strong, you would have stood by yourself as we do, independent and free. Your allies are strong, and it is because of your weakness that you've had to solicit, as does a prostitute." Overall, 1914 to 1918 was a relatively quiet period in Somalia in terms of actual fighting, but that would change after the armistice in November 1918. Hassan's dervish state was now in a vulnerable situation. There was no support forthcoming, no matter even how remote or symbolic, from the Ottomans, and his state was now hemmed in the interior, with no access to the coast or to any port city to import weapons. And it was surrounded by hostile tribes and British-funded scouts. This meant that Hassan could not offer as much protections to his followers as he had in the past, and this led to an increased amount of desertions. In addition, dervish efforts to build a more stable state now actually began to work against them. Instead of being able to wage mobile guerrilla warfare against their enemies as they had in the past, the dervishes now depended on a network of stationary forts. And the limited territory they controlled meant that they did not have the space to outmaneuver the slower British columns. With the end of the Great War in Europe, Britain was now free to turn its attention to its colonies, and it was still worried about unrest among its Muslim subjects, and so an influential preacher like Hassan would simply have to go. Some have also suggested that revenge may have been a motivating factor, since Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill may have wanted to make up for the embarrassing British withdrawal from the interior of Somaliland years before. As early as December 1918, the British began to draw up plans for an attack, and British Major A.B. Russell had high hopes for the role of air power in the coming campaign. The hope and expectation was that the sudden and unexpected attack from the air, a possibility hitherto unthought of by the mullah and his followers, could cause a moral collapse, and that mopping up would then be easy. At least one Somali historian has argued that the campaign was launched at least partly to test out the effects of air power in colonial war. But it was fall 1919 by the time the British cabinet actually approved the offensive. A group of about 150 Royal Air Force officers entered the colony posing as geologists looking for oil. But they were really there to scout locations where emergency airfields could be built for the so-called Z-Force. The dozen or so aircraft were brought to Somalia on the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal and joined the British strike force consisting of 1,500 Somali tribesmen, 850 men of the King's African Rifles, 440 Indian troops, and about 1,000 Egyptian camels. The British launched their offensive on January 21st, 1920. They'd received reports that the mullah was at the fort near Medishe, and that is where the first clashes took place. According to some accounts, the very first bomb dropped by the RAF exploded near Hassan and killed his uncle, which caused him to decide to retreat. Jardine assumed that the Somalis had no prior knowledge of the existence of aircraft, and that the mullah's advisors had been too afraid to tell him the truth once they'd figured out what the strange new machines actually were. The dervishes were as unaware of the termination of the Great War as they were of the existence of aviation. Some advisors, with the Oriental's native penchant for flattery, suggested that they were the chariots of Allah, come to take the mullah up to heaven. And Hassan himself was said to have blamed the aircraft for his defeat in song. Because of the furious thunder and lightning they generated, the sky could not be told from the earth. The English have brought with them flying monsters from Aden. Under these trying circumstances, what else was a person to do but to make a run for his life? The British Camel Corps pursued the dervish forces at a furious pace. Medishe and Jidbali were taken, and the British and their Somali allies stopped to rest at Houdin on February 2nd. During one 72-hour period, they'd advanced 150 miles and captured large amounts of weapons, supplies, and herds of livestock. But they had not caught the mullah. Some historians have suggested that it was a military mistake for the mullah to have retreated, since his forts were actually well built and the British bombs were in fact quite small. Major Russell was impressed when he inspected the fortress at Houdin. It would have required heavy artillery to have much impression on the forts, as they all had walls 9 feet thick. And when the British took some of the abandoned forts, they destroyed them to prevent further use. The main fort and the dervish capital of Taleh was taken in early February, and the campaign was over by February 24th. By this point, the mullah and his followers had retreated to Shinelech in eastern Ogaden, but were harassed by British-friendly tribes and the RAF along the way. One prominent Somali who'd fought against Hassan, Ali Dukh, expressed his joy at the fall of the mullah. The fall of those who have treated one unjustly occasions exultations and joyous celebration. Now watch with glee as the horrid priest is driven about like tumbleweed by the wind devils. So the British had defeated the dervishes, and now they sent out a peace mission which included several Somali tribal leaders in order to negotiate. They reached Hassan on April 27th with a letter from Governor Archer. After wishing the mullah good health, he offered the British terms: an assigned territory for the dervishes to live on, freedom of religion, and acceptance of the exclusive British right to resolve disputes between Somali tribes. The mullah listened to the British envoys, but he never did send a response, and he remained isolated in his camp until January 1921, when he died of influenza, even though there's still some debate about the exact date. His last message to his followers reflected both his religious and nationalist beliefs. There is no prosperity or peace that can come from entering into treaties and agreements with the infidel, for he cannot be trusted. Even if I failed to get a flag that would be flown for me between here and Nairobi, have I failed to get God's mercy and the gift to see the Prophet's face? His supporters divided the remaining herds of livestock and mostly returned to their tribes. Mullah Hassan's dervish movement was one of the most significant of its kind in the history of colonial Africa. Part Islamic revival, part Somali nationalism, it was central to the politics of the Horn of Africa for 20 years. Although his movement ended with his death, Mullah Hassan has gone down as a major figure in Somali history. The Mad Mullah to the British, an African Napoleon to the Italians, and to many others, a great poet, an anti-colonial resistance leader, and the father of Somali nationalism. The end of the dervish movement did not bring an end to the instability in Somalia. Tribes loyal to the Obiya and Midratain sultanates lodged competing claims immediately after Hassan's death, and the British and Italian colonial interests remained. Peace in the Horn of Africa was a long way off. Now, the conflict between the British and the Somali dervish movement is not one that you'll often see covered on other history YouTube channels. Now, frankly, in the grand scheme of YouTube's reach, history is a bit of a niche topic, and they haven't made it any easier on creators like us to bring you a detailed and hopefully objective view of historic events. That's why we crowdfunded and released our Battle of Berlin documentary, 16 Days in Berlin, specifically outside of YouTube, where 250 of our videos were retroactively demonetized because they changed their rules years after these videos were made. And given this kind of climate, we've taken further steps to be safe in the future. We teamed up with some other creator friends to have a platform where we don't have to worry about YouTube's capricious actions. This platform is called Nebula. On Nebula, you can watch top educational creators like us ad-free and support them at the same time. For example, this video you're watching now doesn't have this very ad on Nebula. And we can publish content there which we can't put on YouTube, like our documentary series 16 Days in Berlin, which I've just mentioned. So what does this have to do with CuriosityStream, another platform for classic, high-quality documentary content? They like what we're doing on Nebula, and they're supporting it with a pretty sweet deal. If you sign up for CuriosityStream through curiositystream.com/thegreatwar, you get access to 2 platforms instead of 1. So signing up through curiositystream.com/thegreatwar gets you access to both CuriosityStream and also to Nebula. And right now, You can sign up for 41% off, less than $12 for an entire year. It's not a trial or anything. You'll have access to Nebula as long as you're signed up for CuriosityStream. So if you want to watch a fascinating documentary about Australian nurses in the Vietnam War, you can do that on CuriosityStream. And if you want to watch the most detailed documentary about the Battle of Berlin, you can do that on Nebula. So that's curiositystream.com/thegreatwar, and right now it's 41% off, less than $12 a year. As usual, you can find all the sources we used for this video in the video description. And if you want to support our channel, you can do so on Patreon, and you'll find a link for that in the video description as well. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War 1921, a production of Real-Time History and the only YouTube history channel that wants you to know that in Somalia 100 years ago, one rifle cost 300 camels.